guess in a broad stroke, my assignment as I experience it, which is really a positive statement in regards to the passion that I have for the work that I do, is around agriculture. Is Really the vision that I have is a regional regenerative agricultural system. And within that, we can address all of the big issues that we face, from poverty to hunger to climate change to economic development to public health, healthcare, et cetera. It's really the most potent cross-disciplinary action I think that we can take, is to raise the profile of agriculture. And I define agriculture as broader than just growing crops and food. It's also human health. It's how it impacts environmental health. It's what we eat. It's how we eat. These things, eating is an agricultural act. It's one of my favorite quotes, Wendell Berry. So, whether we like it or not, everyone is a part of the agricultural system. And when we look at it that way, really the work that I do is around asking everyone to take a seat at the table, and be conscious of their involvement in that regard. So I've played that out over the last 20 years. I started a garden center called Progressive Gardens. I did that for about 15 years in Wilmington, and I had a wholesale company doing compost tea. We built compost tea brewers and the recipe ingredients that went into it. Did that all over the country, and had an organic lawn care company. Ran a farm out in Castle Hayne, community supported agriculture model. Fed 75 families for 3 seasons, and had a wheatgrass sprout business as well. And at one point, did all of that at one time, which was just way too much. But it really amounted to a boot camp for me in a lot of ways. And I was blessed to be in the ecosystem of my passion and planted seeds for 20 years that I'm now starting to harvest in some respects. I wish that I could say that I had foresight to all of that to bring me to where I am, which is not the case at all. But it was definitely an exercise of following my passions the entire time. And so as that formalized, I started a consulting platform. I call it Be Agriculture. Be a part of agriculture. Again, whether we like it or not, we already are. So to try to generate awareness around that, and I'm playing that out on a national level, working with groups like Farmers Footprint and Kiss the Ground, and Understanding Agriculture, and some really amazing organizations that are championing what's loosely called regenerative agriculture. This concept of growing soil, not just plants. Thinking about things as a forest rather than the tree. We don't want to yield at all costs and kill the soil while we're doing it. That's what we would call conventional agriculture, which is 99% of modern agriculture is conventional, and it's catching up to us in a lot of very serious ways. The topsoil is running out. Chronic disease is off the charts and almost exponential. And we seem not to have a collective answer to why these things are happening. And in my identification of it, it's really the toxicity and the kind of misguided methods of conventional agriculture. So with that, I play on the national level with it, but I've really focused on trying to bring that home to create a regional regenerative agriculture system in southeastern North Carolina, which is not a one-person game, but it's the one that I'm playing, and I like to play with as many people as possible. So if this is interesting to you, let's talk further for sure. But that looks like this food farming and human health paradigm that I've kind of fleshed out there. The food co-op, Northside Food Co-op, really kind of strikes to the heart of that. We can impact the regional farming systems by how food is grown. We can impact the how and what people eat. We can also move the markers on metrics of public health. So it was a really kind of potent opportunity for my personal passions. And I'm also an elected supervisor of New Hanover Soil and Water Conservation District. It's kind of a mouthful. Nobody knows what it is. So in that respect, I always like to make sure people are aware. It's a state level designation. It's voted on locally. It's on the ballot every 2 years. And there's 5 supervisors. 3 of them are elected, 2 are appointed. And we have a staff that's within the county hierarchy. But my jurisdiction is not in the county or city hierarchy. It's at the state level. So it gives me a lot of freedom to operate autonomously without oversight in our area around these issues. And the majority of that landscape is agriculture, and we're not an agricultural county. We're very small geographically. We wouldn't be able to grow all of our own food if we wanted to. Not enough space, and there's also the property value wouldn't allow traditional farming, right? So because of that, we basically have an absence of farming in New Hanover County. And part of the premise of this work that I'm doing is around saving farming in New Hanover County, about taking some ownership and accountability within that reality of it being really the birth of what the human story has been. When we planted seeds and started farming, that's when cities started to be built. Specialization is really the origin of our kind of modern posture as a human species. And I feel like we're really trying to get back to that more consciously now than ever before. So part of that is engaging the Board of Education. I just visited Holly Shelter this morning, school in Castle Hayne, and the teacher there, Dan, is the only agricultural teacher in all of New Hanover County. And so I'm lobbying them to create more exposure around this idea that agriculture is for everybody. And I'm the policy director at the Feast Down East Learning Farm project. And that's generated a $200,000 planning grant to establish an urban farm in the city limits of Wilmington, hopefully in a low wealth community. That project actually started from me running my mouth through Soil and Water, just saying we needed to save farming in New Hanover County. We need to establish a farm, and enough people heard it to where we wrote a grant, and nobody thought we would get it. And Feast Down East got it. It's amazing. And so my role in that has been to lay the groundwork to make sure that the farm can happen based on how the laws are written in Wilmington, which is a strange statement because it's currently illegal to grow food in your landscape and sell it outside of a 60-day window in Wilmington. And now that's not written because didn't want people to farm. It's written because nobody's ever had the conversation before. And the 60-day window is there for Lewis Farms so that they can do their U-pick operation. So that kind of gives you a window into the passivity of the ownership around agriculture. So I'm really pitching, we need to make farms the new breweries. We need to make it hip. We need to create incentives for people to do this. And if you investigate people like Curtis Stone, total extreme, but this guy generates $100,000 a year out of a quarter of an acre residential property with a house on it. It's a credible operation. YouTube Curtis Stone and $100,000, and there's an 18-minute YouTube video that's mind-blowing. And that's not to say everyone would be able to do what he's doing, but what if that number instead of 100,000 was $5,000, $10,000 a year? There's your affordable housing issue solved. So we're actually seeking to put that into action with the co-op as another example. Another hat I'll wear is the co-chair of the Eagles Island Central Park Task Force that is trying to conserve and keep in preservation, recreation, and education around the 3,000-acre Eagles Island between Brunswick County and downtown Wilmington, where the battleship is. That project hooked me because of the farming that happened there back in the late 1800s. The Gullah culture, we're at the northernmost point of the Gullah Geechee corridor. We're farming rice. You can still see the rice fields that are laid out on the north side of Eagles Island. They were farming indigo and rice there, and that was the first enterprise of Wilmington. It put us on the map as a port city, and all of that history was obliterated in the coup of 1898. So history doesn't really tell us these stories, and it started with agriculture. So, I see this like in living color everywhere, and I'm really trying to bring the reality of the ability to reach people from a storytelling standpoint, from a nourishment standpoint, from all of these important places on a lot of different levels. So I think, that's a fair landscape of where I'm coming from in this.
You sound like you wear a lot of hats.
Couple.
So thank you so much for that awesome introduction. Sort of heading into the first question, you hit on it a little bit. But if you could just shed some light on your journey within sustainability or within your current field, whether it be education experiences or like related work experiences, like how did you get where you are today?
Yeah. I mean, not to be, well, I mean, to be completely honest with you, I just followed what I was interested in. And that's an easy thing to say, not an easy thing to do. But there's a bit of serendipity into it. I went to UNCW, graduated in 2001, and I got a degree in biology, got a BS in biology, and a degree in religion. And those are somewhat counterintuitive in some ways. And at the time, it really wasn't intentional. I was just simply wanting to learn about what I was interested in. And looking back, I was always really trying to tie everything together, to figure it all out. It's like that was really what I had by default, was just this inability to see anything other than the systems. You can't solve dynamic problems with linear thinking, right? And I think that reality is a lot of the disconnect and the gaps that we're seeing in how we're managing ourselves is not really respecting the true cost of things and the true potential of things. So sustainability really treads in that arena. Um, when I graduated from UNCW, I was a little disillusioned. I had learned how to learn, but I didn't actually get what I was interested in ultimately. And I was seeking that, and I was disillusioned because I didn't know what it was. And I moved to the Virgin Islands, honestly, and it was sort of against the grain of what I was supposed to be doing. But it was the best thing that I ever did, because I went, didn't know anyone, made community, and kind of live the experience of, if you have your head on your shoulders and you put a good foot forward, you can make it work wherever you go. And had that experience and found this book called Secrets of the Soil, and it just really blew my mind. It inspired me to this day. It's why I'm doing what I'm doing. And the gist of this book was that there's more to life than what's physically here. And you know religion does a good job of trying to define what I mean by that, right? And in doing that, creates a context for people to disagree and to start wars and all of these things that are counterintuitive, I think, to a spiritual uh, reverence. And what this book gave me was that I didn't need to invest in dogma to have reverence for the idea that there is a life force, right? There's a reason that a plant grows up against gravity. We spend so much time thinking about how Newton got hit in the head by an apple to ponder gravity, but not any time thinking about how the apple got up there to begin with, right? And it's this idea of, we're really treading on half the story, and that this book really gave me a certain reality and a way into that. And one of the first chapter was around biodynamic agriculture. If you've never heard of that, it was developed in 8 lectures in 1924 by a man named Dr. Rudolf Steiner. And he actually never used the term biodynamic. That was given afterwards. But he was asked by farmers that are now in Eastern Europe, who had first started to use chemical agriculture that came from the First World War. A lot of the munitions and the pesticides that we use even to this day were invented by the military industrial complex. So this was really the first time on Earth that farmers were using unnatural materials in farming enterprises. And they were seeing diseases in their animals they'd never seen before, and they knew something was wrong. And they asked Dr. Steiner to give lectures on how do we regenerate the life force of our farm. And there was a real passage in the preface to the agricultural course lectures, which is a book called the Agriculture Course. And he was asked by one of his students at the time, why do people not carry out the wisdom that you're putting forward? Why do we not show up for ourselves? In so many words, it was a paraphrase of what the quote was, but his answer was, it's a matter of nutrition. And he said that food plants no longer contain the forces people need to build a bridge from thinking to will and action. And when I read that, I was like, the world made sense. It's like our food system is not providing the forces that people need to be what we can be, right? And I sort of saw, like, we can all know what the problems are, but how many people actually go try to do something about it, right? And it gave me this mechanism to see the world in this way. And so it really inspired me. And that spark is what created Progressive Gardens, because the bank used to give you money back then, and I wrote a stupid business plan and got turned down the first time, and came back and figured it out, and borrowed a little money from family, and we started this business, and had carpet on the floor of a garden center, had no loading dock. We were carrying 2 bags of soil through the front door. I mean, I don't know how it worked, but it did, and I did that for 15 years. Not carrying 2 bags of soil through the front door the whole time. I learned a lot along the way, but it was sort of a signal to me that I was in the right space in a certain way. And so sustainability, really, to tie it to your question, is a really important concept, but there's an element of it when you apply it to agriculture that doesn't hit the mark. It's a system that is where it should be sustained. So much of what we're doing, you can't sustain what we have and call it sufficient, right? So there's a danger in saying, oh, well, we just need to make it sustainable. What does that actually mean? It actually means we need to regenerate it, right? And we need to be very literal about that. And agriculture is a really good example of that. There's studies that are coming out now that are telling us things we already know. The topsoil that was 10 feet deep in Iowa to begin with is a mere inches and disappeared in a lot of places. This is measurable. We can't sustain what we have. And the interesting thing about soil is it can be regenerated. nature has this mechanism to upbuild, right? And a lot of man-made uh, enterprises are extractive, and we're spending that abundance that has been generated for us. And so an awareness in that, for me, it doesn't, sustainability doesn't play through what we need to do. It's sort of a signal word. So I don't, it's not like, oh, I disagree with sustainability. It's more that what I'd like to add to it is say, look, we need to regenerate what we have. We need to be conscious of that, because if we stop at sustainability and just call it good, we got a lot of work to do. So the journey has been, in a nutshell, sort of that, coming from complete oblivion from a society that doesn't teach me the things that I really wanted to know. And I got out of college and I didn't even know what I wanted to know, right? I mean, if that's not an allegory for the world that we live in a lot of ways, and that's changing, information is more accessible and these stories are being told in different ways, but that's really a lot of where the passion for what I do comes from, because I was seeking and I really didn't find what I wanted to see, frankly, until the universe sort of found me. I like to say that instead of me finding that book, it found me, and I really believe that, so I really try to show up and follow the thread in that way. It's, where's the attention, where's the energy, where can we make an impact? And there's even an element of having to come up with new language to talk about some of the things that we do. So yeah, it's been a long, strange trip, and I'm still not quite sure where I am. So here we are.
I like your answer. I feel like it was nice and reached a lot of like different areas. And I don't know, I like the idea of like rethinking what sustainability does really mean and kind of the impact that it has on our lives. So to the next question, you can definitely answer this as you please, because as Maya said, you wear a lot of hats and don't really just have one position. But what was it that drew you to the specific things that you're working on now?
Yeah. Well, I mentioned earlier with the co-op, it was really on that one. It was, I had a pretty clear view of like, all right. So I guess to answer it a different way, I got into business because I was inspired, and I frankly didn't know how else to pursue the passion of what I was inspired by and pay my bills, other than starting a business to tell people about it and be about it, right? And I was fortunate, I suppose that's the right word, at the time. There wasn't a store that was championing what we were doing. Still not sure there is a store that was championing what we're doing based on some of the things we were doing, but at the time, we sold hydroponic equipment, for example. There was only one store in the entire state of North Carolina that did that in 2001. So we were sort of ahead of the curve in that way of having a pioneering space to move into. And that was, I was fumbling around, like I didn't have the clarity that I do now. And so I was very fortunate to find a way into my passion, and start to formulate, a better clarity from the beginning. And so I would say, very simply, I was following my passion in the beginnings of it. And then as I, was able to work within that and refine what I was looking for, I realized some 14 years later, 13, 14 years later, that you know, in fairness, I think I'd realized it sooner, but I didn't put it into action. That I didn't really get into any of it for the business. That what the point wasn't to try to get rich. Matter of fact, I'd already had the next company started and the money spent before the money came in. And it was about addressing the issues and the problems that I saw, and learning about it more so than the business. And that actually was a great challenge for me, because you can't run a business and not be about the business, right? Like you have to learn about the business, it's going to teach you. So I learned a lot of lessons in that, and lessons that I'm able to share with other people in the consulting that I do that have value. So it all had value. But when I really kind of took an inventory of, all right, like what am I here in the world for? After I'd moved through 15 years of business and doing a lot of great things in my interest field and all of that, I really I realized that the business piece that was running me around at that point wasn't what I was about. So I started to extract myself from the business piece of it and imagine what was next. And at that point became really clear, this was 3-4 years ago, that what really excited me was the connecting piece, was when people were interested and I was able to provide some element of assistance in their journey and pass forward what I've been blessed to be taught and have learned along the way. That's really where I get a lot of energy from. And then I'm also a published writer. I've been writing in different garden and farming publications for 15 years. And I think I'll probably write a book or two someday. Just really enjoy that piece of it. And so saw that. And so the education, the writing, the learning, and really the startup, the creative aspect of it was what really kind of woke me up in the morning. So I got really clear with that. And with that clarity, was able to see that a lot of what I was carrying didn't serve me. And I didn't really realize how much I was carrying until it wasn't there anymore. And that took about 12 months to kind of wind everything down, sell off the assets, do the business piece of it. And when I had that moment kind of on the other side, it wasn't really a single moment, but when I arrived in that space with all of this space, and I had created this clarity about, what I wanted to be about. And, at the time I was using a consulting platform I called bioenergetic agriculture. And the premise was that there's a physical, mineral, biological, and energetic capacity to a living system. And if you think about what conventional agriculture is, it's physical and it's mineral. You plow the soil, you fertilize it, and it's all good. And then you're creating all of these problems that you're chasing around with poisons, right? That's basically agriculture. Organic agriculture brings in the biological component and uses natural materials and makes some sense of that. But both completely discount the idea that there's this force to life, right? And biodynamics had inspired me to the literalness of that. And I quickly met a biodynamic farmer after I read Secrets of the Soil that served to validate the premise of that. This wasn't just woo-woo kind of witchcraft stuff that was a cool idea, right? Like it functionally had a real service to a farmer and to the world. So I've lived that, right? Like I'm not desensitized to the idea that the celestial rhythms have an impact on the crops that you grow, when you plant, when you harvest, what type. The Farmer's Almanac carries the wisdom of the moon affecting plant growth. Well, if the moon affects plant growth, why not the rest of the celestial cycle, right? So that was one component of what biodynamics tread on, was how to bring the stars into the farm and how to create the farm as an organism, not unlike the organs we have in our body, right? If we're missing an organ, the organism doesn't work. Well, the farm is the same way. So there was all of these wisdom points. And so I was coming through all of this knowledge, and with that clarity that I generated in the space that I had cleared, and that's when projects like the Food Co-op became on the radar, and it started to fill in all of these new ways, right? And there was an element of faith. I mean, I didn't plan it that way, right? But looking back, I wish that I could have had a lot more confidence and how I was approaching it than I did. I mean, and this is human nature. It's natural when you're moving into the unknown. But I say that in that way because the premise of this call is to try to, play back some of the experiences that I've had of people moving out into the world and trying to find out what they're going to do with their life. Have confidence in the things that you're passionate in, and jump. I'm a full believer in that. But the key is to make sure you've identified what you're passionate about first, and sometimes that's the struggle. So I don't want to kind of oversimplify it, but I think it was a combination of actually the way that this question is written, what drew you to most to the current company or organization. Also feel like there was a gravity of what I had created, right? So it was kind of like, it wasn't like me trying to go find it and like put in a resume and get hired. I was simply kind of sitting in my passion, in my space with at the now in my career, the roadmap that's gotten me here. And, there is a law of attraction, and I won't get too far out and woo with you, but these things are real, so I have some faith in that and balance that with the realities that we also have to deal with in regards to paying the bills and things like that. But, ultimately, if the entire world could show up to work in the space that we were called to be in, and with the passions that we deserve to have, how much better would the world be? I mean, that's sort of an easy thing to say again, but I think the effort is to try to build a society that allows outlets for people to feel that, and that's a lot of the consciousness that I try to bring to some of the projects that we're working on. Unfortunately, when you're doing things like the Food Co-op, to really see the struggles in the world, and look under the hood and feel the challenges that are faced by so many people in our, just to put a point on it, in downtown Wilmington. It's heartbreaking, And so I don't mean to come here and just say, oh, you just got to be passionate and go, things will find you. There's a lot more to it. But if you're not, if you're in a position to invest in that and you're not, you're missing the boat, and I think the people that are have some level of responsibility to pay it forward with the people who aren't yet. And that's a lot of the sense of what I have in a lot of the work that I do.
What an awesome response. I love this question. I like all the questions, but just to hear everybody's specific stories of how they got to where they are in a little bit more of like a targeted approach than the first question.
Mhm.
But once again, with the third question, you sort of hit on it already, but besides like learning how to learn, what do you feel like you took away from your like college experience that you use in your career now?
Yeah. I'll be honest with you, not much. Um, and that's not a statement to say you shouldn't go to college, because I would do it again in the way that I did it, I think. But it taught me a lot. I'm not going to say I didn't learn anything, but I can tell you definitively, based on the awareness that I've lived now, 20 years out of school and out of college, and looking back at biology class and what I took at UNCW, there was a real absence of a systems mentality. There wasn't a curriculum that tied everything together, and that's part of the danger of school, is that we compartmentalize, right, and we specialize, and we end up so far down the road that we can't holler back to anybody else and make sense of it. And this is not a black and white conversation, so there's plenty of people that get it, and I'm not trying to be pompous or anything like that. But my experience in school, I think, would have been different if I had allowed myself to, or if I don't allow myself, maybe is a strange way to say it, but if I had been fortunate enough to find my passion before I went to college, I wonder what the percentage of people is that do that, right? Which is basically nobody. So I don't mean to criticize it. I think it's more of a statement of the process more than it is to say, oh, well, college didn't do enough for me. I mean, in a lot of ways, college did everything for me. It gave me a degree. It taught me in a way that forced me to go the route that I did to find the passion that I have, right? Doesn't necessarily mean it has to come from school. That was my journey. Plenty of people find their passions in school. So um, and I could say things, like learning how to ask questions. I have kids. I have a 14-year-old and a 9-year-old, and I look at my 14-year-old's handwriting now, and I'm very proud. My 9-year-old is struggling. So I say that because one of the real things that I learned, I had some teachers that taught me how to take notes. And I see that in how I organize things now. So it's an interesting question also, because it's 20 years out, and I'm such a different person now than I was when I didn't know what I wanted to know. That it's interesting. I'm kind of sitting here taking inventory a little bit. Um, but again, in all fairness, I think the world's also changed in a lot of ways. I mean, I think I was really at the point where the reason I went to college is because it was what I was supposed to do. And I didn't really know what else to do, right? And in the world now, I mean, I have some questions. My kids are Blythe's 4 years out from even thinking about this, 3-4 years out, and I could see her not needing to go to college. She doesn't quite know where the angle she wants to go, but that wasn't a thought in the world that I was living in when I was 18. It was just going through that motion. So as far as specific skills, I think school plays a role, but school is not life, right? So if I could have done it again, I would have found a way to put myself out into the community a little bit more, rather than just follow the road that college was giving me. I think college and you have groups like the Center for Healthy Communities, the Equity Institute, that are frankly fairly new, and their whole premise is to get students out into the world, right? That didn't exist when I went to college. So I think it's kind of a moving landscape in some ways. But I sort of struggled to look back and say, oh, well, I couldn't have done this without college, because, college didn't help me write a business plan. I was a biology degree. College didn't help me start a business or get a loan or do any of those things. Maybe it gave me some confidence as well. But I think that's going to be a completely different answer depending on who you're speaking with.
I really liked that answer. I think it's like it speaks to the way that school is so much more than just what you learn in classes. And
Yeah.
also a good reminder for us students that school is not life because sometimes it
It
can
can feel
feel
that way, right?
like it is.
No doubt.
Yeah, but going off of that, what are some things that you feel like you have learned since school and like, or in school, aside from classes, that you feel like have really helped you in the life that you're living and in the positions that you're holding and everything?
God, this is a really interesting question, and I have to answer it for what came to mind first. In some ways, the I separate. Well, I don't separate. I show up in the way that the world is. Um, that's not. It's very difficult to have, let's call it, a spiritual perspective on life and show up in conventional mainstream channels and hold that space. There's a certain and I'll tell you what I mean by that. So Rudolf Steiner, I mentioned earlier, he's been a tremendous inspiration to my life, and the fact that people have not heard of his work, in my view, really speaks to how powerful his message is. And it gets into some controversial spaces in the sense that his real premise, because he gave 8 lectures on agriculture, but he gave over 6,000 lectures in his lifetime. Um, Mostly lectures are his books. He wrote a couple of books as well, but the premise of his work was around reincarnation and karma. And when you start talking about reincarnation to people who were raised in a religious household, it can be a difficult conversation. That's just one example, and not negative, but beliefs clash, right? Um, so a lot of the work that I do is from a premise. And I guess I'll just share this about my upbringing. My parents divorced when I was 4, and um, I lived my entire life with separate families, and I'm sitting a sob story. It's more, I'm very grateful for where I'm at and all of that. But yeah, my mother married a Jewish man, so I grew up with like Hanukkah and Christmas at the same time, right? Like I never was handed this kind of dogma, I'll put it that way, of this is how you're supposed to believe, and it gave me a certain freedom to operate in that I feel very blessed by. And when I found Steiner's work, it was on the back of going to school for religion, to kind of weave that in a little bit. And the way they teach religion in school is not religious at all. It's very academic, right? You're looking at you know uh, the books in the Bible and who wrote them and historical dates, and the prompt is, oh, these are just people like you and I. And so I went through this moment of like being almost agnostic, right? Like I couldn't figure out certain channels, and oh, we're just physical beings in the world. And then I found Steiner's work, and it really blossomed this spirituality in me, and this real appreciation and reverence for the natural world, and energy, not being like woo wooed out by that, right? Like really respecting that and working with it. And it's added so much to my life that is a very, I'm sharing it now, but this is not the kind of thing that you show up in a soil and water conservation district meeting and be about, right? So I don't want to say I live a double life, because I'm obviously talking about it in this way, but I bring all of this up to say that you know what this, I think the main skill that I've learned, and I wanted to offer what I just said in a way to say, I started Progressive Gardens with that mindset. Can I create a dialogue and a way in which to connect with the world on these things that have given me so much, right? So I was inspired, and then I wanted to give back, and that was really why I did it. And I went through a couple of years being really frustrated, honestly, with why are people not as inspired as I was? Why don't they get it and be about it? And, I learned that lesson a long time ago, that it's not about converting people. It's not about, recruiting people. It's about holding space and, connecting with people when people are ready or not. And so, what I learned through 15 years of retail was how to meet people where they are, right? And how to have respect for everyone's perspective. Understand that, not to be cliche about it, but that we are all connected, right? Like we are one, whether we were turned off by this kind of idea or not. It's a literal truth. And so to discover that and to have reverence for this reality from a spiritual perspective, with a gift like biodynamics that can allow me to see the resonance between the planetary reality the earth or organs, the plant preparations on a farm, how to create resonance between all of that. And it's a big thing that's not taught in school. Again, I can talk about it in that way because I've spent 20 years studying it. But with that, I think that's really trying to get to the finish line here and my point. But the idea is that I was given this, what I perceive as great wisdom, and I was always trying to find a way to communicate about it and to connect with people on it in a way that was comfortable, right? And in that effort, it really refined my ability to have respect for everyone and where they are in that process, and not show up with any sort of expectation, and do the work of allowing people to stand in their own space, as well. So, I think really that's the real world thing. If you're passionate about something, it's going to come across, that's not the hard part. The hard part is making sure you're coming across in a way that it's approachable, and that people can really connect with. So I think in my specific vein of my life and my work and what I've been doing, I think that would probably be my answer. Is how to meet people where they are.
So, using all of these questions to sort of reflect on your career journey, what do you wish that you had known as an 18, 19, 20-year-old college student? And what's like a piece of advice you would give to yourself that many years ago?
I think that one piece of advice you wish someone told you. I'm not really sure why this is coming across as a difficult question, because it's not at all like I knew everything. It's quite the opposite. I think the trouble that I find is that I have so much appreciation for the mistakes that I did make. Um, and I think if I was to answer the question, it was really to have confidence, in your passions. And I feel like I've done that, but there are over a 20-year period, everything's not easy, and you find yourself, when you put yourself out there in the world as being responsible for businesses and things like that, you can get into some really difficult spots, and stress, and these kinds of feelings are a very real thing. And I think maybe the most difficult one was, I was maybe 13 years into Progressive Gardens, and I could sort of feel the fact that things weren't moving in the ways that I wanted them to. And Amazon.com, oddly enough, but interestingly enough, had a significant impact on my retail business. I was a specialty store. I had knowledge that people wanted, and they would come and talk for an hour about very specific things that I was helping them with, and then they'd just say, all right, great, thanks, man, I'm gonna go buy this on Prime. And it didn't happen every day, but it happened enough verbally to know that it was happening a lot more than I had any control over. So when I started to read the writing on the wall of, like, the way that I had built my career, and frankly at that point a lot of my identity, right, was attached to the business, that was a really difficult time, and I perceived that in a way that things were falling apart rather than being reoriented. And I think that that wasn't really early on in my career. It was more, because in my experience, it was very successful in the beginning, and it sort of waned over time to towards the end of that retail store. So I think that would probably be my answer, is just to have faith, and confidence in the world supporting you in your passions. I think that that's something that is a very difficult thing to invest in when you feel alone, and when you feel responsible, and when you feel the realities of the world. It postures in a pretty scary way when you don't have the resources you need to make ends meet. And if you have faith in yourself, and the passion that you have, and the knowledge that you've developed and earned, then everything is going to work out good. And I can report that that's been 100% true at every turn. So I think that would probably be my answer.
I think you've been showing that as your answer before this question even showed up. So that's
Fair
awesome.
enough.
Kind of tied the bow at the end.
Mm.
So the last question can be as open-ended as you'd like it to be. I know you touched on kind of wishing that you'd been more community involved, and kind of wishing you knew of, like, wishing college students were more community involved in general. So do you have any suggestions for that, or specifically with the groups you were involved in? Kind of like, just, yeah, take the reins at that one.
That's awesome. Yeah, this is a really important question. And I'll be honest, it's one that with the landscape that I've generated, um, I I sometimes struggle to answer because there's so much there. I mean, one of the things that I didn't mention earlier was I have an organic park pilot project that I'm spearheading and starting in fall in Olson Park in the Murrayville area, and it's come on the back of a year and a half of engaging the city around taking some responsibility and ownership on toxic pesticides that herbicides, et cetera, that are used in city limits on city ball fields or parks or what have you. And again, another conversation that had never been had because it turns out the city doesn't know who's spraying what where. There's no protocol, and that's a big issue for public health, but it's also a huge issue in regards to the city's liability. A lot of these toxins are, losing lawsuits and appeals in California, and change is coming. And so I sort of engineered this conversation about a year and a half ago, and showed the city some things that they couldn't unsee, and that they've agreed to initiate this action off of this bond. I mean, off of a grant that I generated for $10,000 from Stonyfield Organic, the yogurt company, oddly enough. And so we're gonna have this moment, and you know, to do that on my own, engaging the city, yeah, it was a lot of work. But the moment you bring in people, there's a certain responsibility to manage a group that can become overwhelming when you've got 10 groups. And so the moment that I'm in a lot of ways is to try to off source, not really unlike how the learning farm happened. I met a local farmer who was fired up about it, and I gave him the ball, said, look, this is something that needs to happen. He said, heck yeah, it does. And he went to Feast Down East, and they got the grant. And I was able to circle around on that to help that keep it moving that forward. And in a lot of ways, I'm looking for the same thing here, and a lot of the things that I mentioned. I mean, I guess another thing I didn't mention, which is not really a job, but it may be the most important piece of all of this, is I'm not sure if anybody out there has heard of rights of nature. It's a legal designation that basically enacts the rights of a living system to have legal standing. And there's a lot of precedent for this in the world. Toledo, Ohio has written a Lake Erie Bill of Rights. Their water system was shut down for a week from an agricultural runoff phytoplankton bloom in Lake Erie. And the city said, we've had enough, and passed an ordinance or a law in Toledo, Ohio, that allowed any citizen in Toledo to sue agricultural corporate polluters. We experience pollution right now in our drinking water from Chemours, from Duke Energy, from animal agriculture in Smithfield, et cetera, Prestige. And we sit back and can't cross a county line, right? And so we just sit back and we're being polluted, and we're waiting on the state to help us. And what that means is the Department of Environmental Quality is a regulatory agency. There's a concept called regulatory capture. Regulatory agencies, when you do the research in them, are a buffer between the public and their rights and corporate interests. And I don't mean to be conspiratorial. I've just done the research. The reality is the Department of Environmental Quality, in regards to the PFAS pollution that we're experiencing, for example, they're not angling on how to shut Chemours down and make them clean the problem up, right? They're angling on how much PFAS to allow in the river. And when you get clear with that, what that means is they're effectively legalizing the pollution of the environment. They're legalizing the pollution of people. And it's hard to get to that moment and admit that to ourselves in some ways, right? But when you do, things get a lot clearer and the activism changes. No longer do I go to the state level and Department of Environmental Quality and scream at them in hopes that they change their mind, right? In a lot of ways, they've already got their mind made up. And again, this can sound conspiratorial, but the state and the federal politics is fairly bought and sold, where we have a tremendous ability to impact what we have available to protect ourselves in is in a local level. And there's a concept called community rights, and community rights is sort of the umbrella where rights of nature is the legal vehicle. And what it amounts to is passing local laws, ordinances that break state and federal preemption law, that break the law, and in order to protect ourselves. So I've got a Cape Fear River Bill of Rights. I'm actually working with a couple of UNCW students in the POP legislative, Jess and Allie. And so I meet with them occasionally, and we're furthering this dialogue on that vein if anybody wants to join the conversation. But essentially what it amounts to is, at some point this year, I want to deliver the Cape Fear River Bill of Rights that I've written with a law firm called CEDAR in the US. It's got Thomas Lindsay, who founded it, wrote the Constitution of Ecuador. He's written, most of the 200 or so ordinances that have been written to date in the United States. And it has binding action in regards to, most recent election, Florida passed an ordinance at 85% in Orange County, 16th biggest county in the US, to allow themselves this legal posture to sue corporate polluters. And so, that idea has it tends to take the air out of the room in some ways, right? Because it's a pretty fundamental play on corporatism, or the idea that, corporate interests are superseding public health and our own personal rights, which looks like this group here sitting around the table and identifying all the problems, which most people can do, and frankly, most of the solutions, yet nothing ever changes, right? So we're living in this world that's kind of been baked in. It's really baked out our rights in a sense, right? So all that to say, that avenue, I'm looking for people that can champion that, right? So the best advice I could get, with everything that I've been talking about here today, is just to reach out and start a conversation. One of my favorite things to do is this. It's different, and I hope people have questions or comments, and I'd love to learn from you if you have anything to share in the call. But I do find that, connecting with somebody one-on-one, really getting intimate on what the knowledge is and the passion is, and if there are people out there that want to show up and follow through on some of these issues, there's a lot of work to do. Now, that is a general statement. On the co-op end of things, we're a fairly formal organization. It's not like a Rights of Nature initiative, or the Organic Park Pilot doesn't necessarily have a group yet. But the food co-op, we have working committees, we have a board of directors, we have an established business. It's a cooperative business in the sense that, it's not a nonprofit. It's also not a traditional for-profit. It's a cooperative business, Chapter 54, Subchapter 4, North Carolina Code, that says one person, one share, one vote. So it's equity and democracy in action in that respect. And we're inviting a lot of people into that project. We're looking for target area people in the North Side, but we'd like to invite anybody who wants to be involved in that project. Also, the Eagles Island Central Park Task Force, we have a monthly meeting that's open to the public. So there are avenues for some of the things that I'm doing that are mature, and others I'm actually looking for people that might want to take some ownership and start a meeting if you're up for that. No expectations. We can still get together, talk, and make it happen. But it's a challenge to create avenues for people, for the public, to move in without taking on the responsibility of a larger group. And that's really the moment that I'm in, is evaluating how to do that in a way that respects people's time and is worth the effort, if you will. So those are a couple of opportunities. So bottom line is, if you're interested at all in any of this and you don't feel like you had the ability to connect and have clarity on how you could show up in this call, feel free to reach out. I think maybe my contact's on your end, and you feel free to share it, or I could put it in the chat, whatever's easiest.
Yeah, definitely